Hi and happy Friday, everybody. One of the most common questions that I have been getting lately is exactly what is a good fat? I mean, we hear that a lot. Increase your good fat. So what exactly does that mean? And then, of course, how does that actually work? How do I put that in my diet? Well, before we answer that question directly, let's do a little bit of background on fats. A fat is not a fat is not a fat. There are different categories of fat, and having some understanding of this is really important when you're going to make your food choices. So when it comes to categories of fats, there's usually two different ways that these can be categorized. The most common way, the way people are usually used to seeing fats being discussed, is their degree of saturation. And then the second way is their chain length. So we're going to start with saturation. And so when we talk about saturation, what this is really referring to is the actual chemical compound of the fat, the molecule itself. So when we look at the chemical structure of a fat molecule, we are talking about, is there room for any hydrogen on it? So a saturated fat has no what we call double bonds. There's no space for anything to fit on there. The molecule is fully saturated. Now, a polyunsaturated fat has several places, or at least more than one place, that a hydrogen atom could be put on there. It is not fully saturated. And a monounsaturated fat has just one spot that's not fully saturated. So before we get into the specifics on each one of these, one of the important things about saturation when it comes to fats is that it impacts the shelf stability and the heat capacity of the specific fat or oil. So a saturated fat, one where there's no extra space on that molecule, is something that tends to be not only heat stable, but shelf stable. So these are the fats that are the safest to cook with. So when we heat something that doesn't have any double bonds in it, it is less likely to become what we call oxidized. And when a fat becomes oxidized, it produces free radicals, and these can be detrimental to our health. So one of the problems that we've gotten into in our obsession to avoid fat, especially saturated fat, is that we really got to cooking with polyunsaturated fats, fats that have the most space for other things to come into the molecule. These are the least heat stable, and when we cook them or heat them, cook with them or heat them, they tend to become oxidized very readily. There's actually been some papers looking at restaurant oil. So restaurants used to cook in lard, right? But they got away from that, and then of course we know we don't want to be using trans fats. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And so restaurants started frying everything in these vegetable oils, these polyunsaturates. And so when that happens, they become oxidized and rancid really quickly. And because they're not getting turned over in the deep fat fryers all the time, this can be a problem. So that's something really important to know. I recommend to my patients to, when you're cooking, cook with saturated fats. That means use coconut oil, use lard, use bacon fat, or use butter. Those are the things that are going to be the safest and the least likely to oxidize. Okay, so now let's talk about each category individually. Let's begin with our unsaturated fats. Again, remember, these are ones that have one double bond. Now, the most common monounsaturated fat, the one everyone would think about, of course, is olive oil. And that's a great example of a monounsaturated fat. But an interesting thing to know about about olive oil, or really any of the other fats, is they're not generally 100% anything. So olive oil actually contains monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and saturated fats. It's just that the vast majority of the fat in olive oil is monounsaturated. So olive oil is a great example. Other things that are monounsaturated fats are going to be hazelnuts, so hazelnut oil, macadamia nuts, which I always recommend to our patients to eat a lot more of those. So that's a great example of a monounsaturated fat. And also avocados. So when it comes to these kind of fats, increasing them in our diet is very likely to be beneficial for us. There have been a number of studies that show that replacing carbohydrates in the diet with monounsaturated fats are good for cardiovascular risk. So use that olive oil liberally. You can heat it better than a polyunsaturated, but I still recommend, if you're going to heat the oil, to be using a saturated fat. But this is a brilliant oil and can be used very liberally on our salads and in many things. It's a great marinade. There's just wonderful things that you can do with olive oil. And of course, avocado, fantastic addition, extra way to increase your fat in your diet. Okay, let's move on to polyunsaturated fat. So these are going to be kind of the most complex here. These have more than one double bond. They tend to be the least shelf and heat stable of all of the different fats. Now, the thing with polyunsaturated fats is that there's two different kinds, two different main groups within this category. There's the omega-3s and then the omega-6s. And the omega-3 and 6 just refer to where on the molecule the double bond is. So let's start with the omega-6s. Look, we're probably getting far too many of these in our diet. So when we're talking about bad fats, this is probably a place where we actually want to decrease the amount of these kinds of fats that are coming into our diet. Honestly, the jury is not completely settled on omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. There have certainly been some articles that have linked high intake of polyunsaturated fats to cancer, and I'm going to post links to those articles along with this video. But they do lower LDL cholesterol, and that was the reason why they were pushed for so many decades. Eat more polyunsaturated fats, they're going to lower your LDL cholesterol. That part is true. But to what detriment? And that's the question we really have to ask. Our LDL cholesterol is lower, but if we're having problems with other things such as cancer as a result of them, we really may want to think again. Like I said, the jury is not completely out on these yet, but here's how I would argue we should be thinking about it with our current knowledge base. Look, the cardinal rule to good nutrition is to eat food. And the problem with these highly refined vegetable oils is just that. The bottom line should be, this isn't real food. You can actually watch a video on how vegetable oils are made online. I mean, there is many chemicals put into place to get vegetable oils to your table. Things like hexene, they're actually bleached. I mean, the problem here, bottom line, even without considering everything else, is this really a real food? I would argue that the answer to that is no, and that we need to be really cautious with our intake of omega-6s in the form of these highly refined oils. I mean, how do you make olive oil? Guess how you do it? You press the olives. That's real food. But when we look over at some of these refined vegetable oils, that's hardly the way that it's made. So again, more information, more science, more literature coming out on this all the time. But the bottom line, I think the easiest way to look at it is, look, these things are not real food. Now, another interesting article I'm going to post a link on in relation to all this omega-6 question is a study just came out. Now, it was a mouse study, yes, but again, those can provide us with some really valuable insight as well. And what it showed is that soybean oil actually is more obesogenic than even fructose is. And of course, they compared it. What was the best? The third thing they compared to was coconut oil, which of course, saturated fat, but caused the least problems. Yes, we're not really surprised by that. But it's an interesting article nonetheless, and I'll put the link on it along with this talk as well. Okay, so polyunsaturated fats, omega-6 are part of it, okay? The other part is going to be the omega-3s. And look, we've got plethora of evidence here that increasing omega-3s in our diet are going to be beneficial for us, probably on many fronts. So what's the best source of omega-3s? Well, it's seafood. So especially the fatty fishes like salmon. So best recommendation is eat more of these, okay? Get some more salmon or other fatty fishes in your diet. Now the one problem that comes in with increased fish consumption is of course concerns about mercury. And I'm going to address that in another talk later down the line. But again, eating seafood 2 or more times a week in your diet is going to be a beneficial thing. Now if you don't eat seafood, there are other ways that we can get omega-3s. Flax has omega-3s, hemp, but the thing is the omega-3s on there are different kinds that tend to not be quite as beneficial for us as the kind of omega-3s that we find in seafood. Grass-fed meat also has a much higher content of omega-3s. And so if you're not getting the seafood or good sources of omega-3s, it may be a consideration for you to supplement. I'm going to, again, another talk all on its own is going to be on omega-3 supplementation. But for right now, best choice, eating seafood, fatty fish especially. If not, you might want to consider supplementing. Other secondary sources are going to be grass-fed meats and also flax and hemp seeds, chia seeds. Those are other sources of omega-3s. Okay, so polyunsaturated. When we talk about the omega-6s to the omega-3s, again, one of the other questions is our ratios, because Americans consume an exorbitant amount of omega-6s in relation to the omega-3s. So I would argue that our best approach to fix the ratio there is to not only decrease those refined omega-6s, but also increase those omega-3s. All right, so that's polyunsaturated. Now let's move to the big bad dog, right? The saturated fats, what we've been told to avoid for years and years and years. But wait a minute. Okay, these increase our HDL cholesterol. They tend to decrease our triglycerides. They may have a variable effect on LDL, but they're much less likely to oxidize when we heat them. So should we really be avoiding these? No, we shouldn't be avoiding these, okay? The evidence for heart disease is weak at best, and some could even argue almost as if some of it was intentionally misleading. But bottom line is, more and more evidences have come out saying, look, there really is no link to saturated fats and heart disease. In fact, the Dietitian Association in this country recently said that the dietary guidelines should remove it as a nutrient of concern because of the lack of evidence. So, saturated fats, what are the advantages? They taste really good, okay? They are also safer to cook with, okay? And we can get these in a variety of our real food sources. So coconut oil is the first example of it. How's coconut oil made? We press coconuts, real food. And then dairy fat is another great source of saturated fats. So we've got our butter, we've got our heavy cream, and of course animal fats also. So don't be afraid to bring back the lard to cook in that, or savor your bacon grease to use it to cook something else in. Those are all going to be reasonable solutions to increase the fat content in your diet. So then I want to talk about the last category, the truly big bad category, the trans fats. So here's the deal with trans fats. They're not natural, they're made, okay? They were actually patented in, I think it was like 1902, so they've been around for a while, but they've been a huge part of our food supply since the 1970s. Fortunately, the current administration is working to remove them from the food supply completely, and I think that's a really good idea. The idea here, the reason that they came about, is that they make food shelf stable. So what they're doing is they're trying to saturate an unsaturated fat, and again, with the idea that we can keep it around longer. Now, it's really easy for real food, low-carb people to avoid trans fats, because the biggest source of them is in our processed food junk, I would call it. So a lot of the baked goods and things like that. The key word that you're looking for on an ingredient label with trans fats is hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated. Those are the things that we want to avoid completely. All right, so I want a really quick touch on a different category, a different way of thinking about fats, and that's the chain length. And so there's short chain, medium chain, and long chain, what we call triglycerides, fatty acids. Most of what we consume is long chain, but people in the low carb world do consume a reasonable amount of medium chain triglycerides. And there's a lot of reasons that we probably do want to do this. So first of all, what's a source of a medium chain? Coconut oil and palm oil are probably the best sources, the best food sources there are. And then there are also medium chains in dairy fat as well. But what's the deal with medium chains? You've probably heard that term floated around a little bit. Well, medium chains are processed totally differently from our long chains. When fat comes into our body, it gets transported around through a car, if you will. When it comes into the intestine, it leaves the intestine in a car called a chylomicron. It can't travel on its own. It has to leave the intestine in this car. But medium chain triglycerides don't need the car. They can float, they can walk, they can go on their own. So they're much easier for us to absorb. They've been used for people who have absorption problems for other health conditions for a very long time. They've also been used for people who have certain genetic issues with sky-high triglycerides. I'm talking in the tens of thousands. Medium chain triglycerides have been used as a treatment for that for a long time as well. But so what about those of us who don't have those problems with absorption or with super sky-high triglycerides? What are the advantages for us? Well, there's been a number of both animal and human studies that show that there's two big benefits to the medium chain triglycerides. Benefit number one is it increases our energy expenditure. So feeling like sluggish metabolism, my metabolism seems to have slowed down. Well, there's ample evidence that shows that the medium chain triglycerides will increase the energy expenditure. The second thing is that they have increased satiety. So they make us feel full faster than even other fats do. And of course, when we're talking about that, making us full faster, which is going to decrease our intake, increasing our energy expenditure, hey, that seems to make really good sense with the problem that we're having in the society with obesity. And I would say, yes, of course. And there's more and more studies and evidence coming out about those. They're also being looked at significantly, many things on its use in dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So again, the thing about medium chain triglycerides is they are a saturated fat. Yes, so saturated fats. Coming back to our original question on this now, what is a bad fat or what is a good fat? Okay, well the bad fat, definitely, big leader here is trans fats. Avoid them completely. Another fat you probably want to watch the consumption of is going to be those omega-6s, especially when they're coming in the form of those highly refined oils. In addition to some of the problems that we've seen with omega-6s, I'm also going to post something on the flip side of it that argues that we don't have as many problems with omega-6s as we think. And again, going back to the idea that there's still debate on this, but the bottom line is if we stick with that most important rule about eating, which is eating real food, we're going to decrease those significantly in our diet anyway. So that leaves us with our good fats. So what are our good fats? Our monounsaturates, eat those. Olive oils, avocados, nuts, eat those like crazy. Saturated fats, enjoy them, okay? And remember, when it comes to fats, when we talk about something like olive oil, we actually have all three different types of fats in there. That's an important thing to remember too. You're not just getting a monounsaturated with that. So getting those into your diet more. Again, one of the biggest things is to not fear them, right? We've been told so long to avoid them that just the idea of choosing something that seems greasy or putting extra butter on something almost seems so extravagant and decadent. But again, that's the idea with a real food diet. We want to have that decadence. We want to be enjoying our food. We shouldn't be avoiding it, not thinking about food, not finding any pleasure in it anymore. We just don't want it to control us. And when we increase these fats in our diet, what we find is we're just not as hungry. Food doesn't control us, but we can enjoy it still. And potentially, again, when we're putting all those fats into our diet, I would argue enjoying it a lot more. Thanks everybody for watching today. Just to let you know that next week what I'm going to talk about is the micronutrients in a low-carb, high-fat diet. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about alcohol in a low-carb diet. Thanks again.